Okay, so we just got back from Nova, and we figured we would go over it. Um, we, the Gopher, took a team of a couple of guys, and Chris jumped in there too. But you want to?
Yeah, we had two people go, technically three. Jake and Mitchell, both team members that did really well. We were going to have a couple of other team members that couldn't end up going kind of last minute. That's why I jumped in. But we all did really well, and I think we all learned a lot from it.
Yeah, Jake
ended up being a super major class, which was pretty neat.
Jake was playing Tyranids, right? And then
Correct.
Mitch was playing. Was he playing Deathwatch or something else?
Yes, he was playing Marines. Technically, he counted as Deathwatch, but it was kind of just Marines.
Okay. And then, what did you play? Just
I ended up playing Space Wolves. I actually had some Space Wolf units, but not a ton of them. My list was pretty different than most of what Space Wolf lists you see kind of running around out there.
Yeah, I get you.
I was playing the Stormlance detachment, so it's the advance and charge. Mitch was doing the Iron Storm, so it's the rerolls, and he was playing mostly tanks.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then Jake was playing the Harvester detachment. I forget if there's a different name for that, but it goes off the Harvester keyword. So you got a bunch of healing and regenning as you go.
Okay. All right. Well, let's get into it, I guess.
So it was a super major class. That means there was a absolute ton of people. We tried to look up like the official number to be a super major, and I don't know that there is one. That being said, most people tend to see it as like more than 100. And we were at
more than 100's a major, right?
Yes, but the difference between major and super major aren't clear. They just say it has to be way more than 100. So I guess that means 200. Let's say,
and there were like 300 something.
375 or something like that.
And you guys were doing 3 days, 3 games each.
Correct.
Right.
3 games a day for 3 days. It was kind of interesting because they broke it up into kind of 2 events, even though it was still 1. The first 5 games determined, like you played them, and that determined what bracket you ended up in. And then the last 4 games were bracketed. And it was bracketed by your win rate. So at the end of 5 rounds, all the 4 1s played against each other, all the 3 2s, all the 2 3s. So they got broken up in different brackets.
Yeah.
It was pretty neat. It's a decent idea because especially when you got 9 games over the course of a few days, after a few losses, is it really worth staying in? A lot of people might drop out, that sort of thing. So they did this bracketing system to encourage people to stay, because basically there's obviously prizes for whoever wins, right? But
yeah, right.
There's also prizes for whoever wins their bracket. So even if you had a bad first few rounds, and let's say I went 2 and 3, once I go to brackets, it's kind of a fresh start in an appropriate power level bracket, because everyone else there is also 2-3. So if I win the bracket, I also still have a chance at some prize support.
It's like playing,
obviously,
in a way, it's like playing ranked, but they just spent the first half of the tournament ranking everyone into sections, and then you're playing against your ranking. It's kind of like how online games tend to do it.
Yeah, and obviously this isn't a thing that you can do at like smaller events where you have less rounds, but by the time that you get to 3 days worth of events, I think this is is really good. It was a nice way to kind of keep people interested on the 3rd day when everybody's starting to get tired, and they've already gotten 6 games in. Do I really want to get up early and put a bunch of mental effort into it, that sort of thing?
So they had GW terrain, their official terrain layouts from the Pariah Nexus pack.
Correct. Everything was Pariah Nexus.
It was 1 Pariah Nexus setup per day, though, right? So like on Thursday,
correct.
You guys played the same table setup 3 times.
Yep. Each day it changed, but they also chose missions so that the deployments would be the same every day, but they would rotate. So it's while the terrain stayed the same for one day, during that day you would rotate through 3 different deployments. But on the second day, you would change terrain and then rotate through the same 3 deployments.
Okay, that makes sense.
So it made it a little easier because, like, the first game of each day, it would be a little hectic because you're like trying to set up terrain and set up objective markers and get the game going. But the game 2 and game 3 became a little less stressful because the terrain was basically set up. I just had to throw down the objective markers and make sure that the terrain didn't get shifted too much. But it made it a little easier for the other 2 games.
That makes sense. Okay, and then you had 3-hour rounds, not 2.5.
Yeah, it was 3-hour rounds, and a thing I want to call out that was incredibly good. A lot of people will, especially at smaller events, but a lot of people generically will say that it's really hard to get a game done in 3 hours, and partially to help mitigate that problem, but also I would argue to kind of prove a point. They shouted out over the intercom during the event, like time markers. So they would give you, let's say, the first 15 minutes was for like setup and going over lists and, things like that. And then they would say like, okay, but if there's a 3-hour round, you should be starting round 1 at this time. And you should be starting round 2 at this time. And they would call those out. And it was really good, not only because it kind of helped people stay on time, but if you were falling behind, they had a bunch of chess clocks, and they wouldn't say that you needed to do chess clocks, right? If you were playing on time, we don't care. Have a good time. Don't stress yourself out.
Right.
But if they call out like, hey, you should be starting round 3, and you're still like the top half of turn 2, then you were supposed to call a judge over. They would bring a chess clock over, and they would help fix the rest of your game. So because of those mile markers, it was really easy to tell when you were getting behind on time early, instead of being like, oh, there's 30 minutes left and still turn 2. Even if we bust out a chess clock, we can't catch up in time.
Gotcha.
So that was probably one of the best things the organizers did, and I absolutely loved it.
Cool. All right, let's go. So they had the official terrain layouts. I know there's a small gripe, at least.
There's a couple of small ones, but yes. So on the upside, this is a super major, right? So there's a lot of tables, 300 and some, almost 400 people, which means you need half that in tables. GW Official was there. Was running a little vendor booth. By little, I mean huge. But because they were there officially, they also helped out the tournament by supplying all of the terrain pieces. So it was all official GW terrain, as far as I could tell. There was some that I wasn't quite sure on, but I don't know if it's an old sculpt or what, but it was supplied by GW, and then it was all painted. It wasn't painted the crazy best, but it was all pretty good. No complaints. The things that were kind of upsetting is that we were using the official GW layouts, right? And the terrain came from GW. Well, the terrain that GW gave each table didn't quite match up with like the layouts. So when people were trying to set up terrain, there was a lot of, I guess I should say first, they also had acrylic templates so that they were kind of clarifying what the area of the terrain was. And then you would put the terrain pieces on top to match the terrain layout where it showed walls. So you could make it a little clearer as to what you could see through. Nova, along with most tournaments, but Nova decided that you couldn't see through the first floor. They also said you couldn't see through the buildings at all, even if there was a second floor. Not that any of the terrain really did that, but they said you couldn't see through the walls at all. So, again, it made sense. It should have worked out fine, but the terrain that GW supplied didn't quite fit. So there was a lot of, okay, there's this L that goes this way, and it's supposed to go the other way, so it doesn't quite fit on this. So now you have the wall that would like hang off of the template one way, but wouldn't go far enough the other way. And then you had some of the terrains where it kind of makes like a U shape. Again, they didn't quite supply the correct terrain, so you would have like some of the walls hanging off the back of the template, and then they wouldn't touch in the middle in order to get the corners correct facing the correct direction. And so it wasn't the best. This in general shouldn't be that big of a deal, and I'm sure they didn't think it was that big of a deal, because you and your opponent are supposed to like talk about things and totally have like a bit of a conversation ahead of time, being like, hey, are we going to count this wall as closed because it's supposed to be, or, you know, does this overhanging part count at all? The problem became they basically, knowing that this was going to be an issue and that it shouldn't be an issue because you're going to talk to your opponent, they never decided what the answer should be for any of that. They just said talk to your opponent. So over the course of 3 games, effectively 9 if we include all the team members, it bounced all over the place as to, do we count the walls as closed? Do we count the overhanging part? Basically, while we were supposed to be playing a fairly uniformed rule set, when it came to the terrain, the terrain layout was uniform, but the actual terrain on the table wasn't. Some tables had more taller walls than shorter walls. Some had, like I said, they overhang the wrong way and didn't. And it made it to where people kind of weren't playing the same terrain, even though the layout was the same. And that, I don't want to say created any arguments, but if we're talking about like starting at a level playing field and then a player's skill determines if they win, there was definitely like, I went up against a demon player that had some giant demon monsters. Well, during that game, we played the walls are the walls. We didn't correct them to where they were supposed to be. And because of that, he was able to get through like 3 giant, like 2 big demon princes plus a war dog through the center of the board, when if we were playing the walls the correct way, like they would have had to single file through. So right. Again, it's not a complaint. We totally agreed to that. But also, if that happened at my table and that same round some other demon player playing a similar list ruled it the other way, one demon player isn't getting the same, terrain setup or the same options as the other player, which I think was a bit of a faulting. But that being said, like I said, I'm not sure if I can really say that Nova should have like laid down the law as far as that's concerned, or if it's GW who should have put up terrain for their own layout that actually made sense. Like, there's a little bit of I don't know who we should blame for that, but that's a thing that hopefully will get corrected for next time. And like I said, to clarify, I think Nova, especially after talking with some of the judges, I think Nova overall was run extremely well. We were super happy with it. There's just a couple of little things that obviously we could, or hopefully they'll improve for next time.
Yeah, makes sense. Did you talk about the plunging fire thing?
No. So with the GW train they gave, the second little gripe that I had was I was playing a unit, suppressors for Marines, and I think one of the big things that makes them really useful is if you use plunging fire. Without plunging fire, they're only AP1, yada yada. I won't get too far into it, but the short answer is some amount of plunging fire seems appropriate, not only because the rule is in the game, so it seems like I want to say that's intended for GW for us to use. That being said, the terrain was supplied by GW and it wasn't available, so whatever on that part. But I would have really liked to see, even if it was just like 2 pieces, 1 in each deployment zone or something like that, to allow for some plunging fire so that you can interact with the cool rules of the game and allow certain units that really need that effect to be able to use it. I think that would have been great. All the terrain they had was short terrain that was only like 3 inches tall. It was like industrial style terrain. And then each table had 2 buildings that were taller than that. But the taller piece ended up being about 5 1/4 inches, about 5 1/2 almost, but not quite. Yeah. So it was just tall enough that if you were on the top of the building, because you can't see through walls, you couldn't hold any objectives that were below it. You couldn't charge the unit that was up top. So it created this kind of like you couldn't interact with the unit, but also it was too short to actually get plunging fire. So now it's this terrain piece that's different than all the rest, and all it does is remove rules from the game. It doesn't actually add like any other options or rules, things like that.
Yeah.
So that's my other gripe. Obviously, there's a lot of players that, especially assault armies, like, let's say World Eaters, stuff like that, where the plunging fire just doesn't ever show up in their game. or it's only against them. So for the most part, they probably weren't too bothered by it.
Yeah, but
there
then
are
also
definitely factions that
also
cared.
they couldn't charge them, so that's weird.
It's true. Yep, they couldn't be charged while they're on top, which then means if you didn't have the fly keyword, you had to, effectively you had to make like a 6-inch charge while you were underneath them, plus any inches that you weren't directly underneath. That became a whole nother.
Okay, let's talk about the BCP pairings.
Yeah, so there was a lot of talk about this. BCP, or Best Coast Pairings, is used by pretty much every tournament out there. Unless the tournament is so small that they can do it by pen and paper for those that still want to do it that way. Best Coast is actually a great app. It is pretty universally used, not only here in the States, but also in Europe. Like, it's a really good app. So obviously Nova was using that as well. The thing that was discussed a lot, though, is the tiebreakers, for lack of a better term. It's not even really tiebreakers that we're talking about, but it's more about the shifting of your opponent. When you're at a super major and you have this many people, there's a lot of 4-1s. There's a lot of 1-3s, that sort of thing. And obviously if you won a game versus lost a game, that definitely changed who you fought. Totally fair. So if I won my first game, I'm going to play against someone who won their game. If I won my second game, I'm going to play someone who won, their first and second game, that sort of thing. Where it became really weird is that when looking in the app, it totally makes sense. And because this is how it used to be most of the time, is that you would go by win and loss for ranking. And then for everyone who, let's say, won their first 2 games, they would then be ranked by how many battle points they got. This is something that totally makes sense to us because, again, that's how it used to be. And the app showed it that way. Once they created round pairings, the round pairings didn't actually use battle points. That was like the 3rd level of tiebreak. So everyone would be staring and say like, oh man, look at me. I'm in 30th or something like that. And that would be before they made the new pairings. But as soon as they made the new pairings, it would drop them down to, let's say, 70 something. Because it wasn't about how many battle points they had anymore. And then it was opponent win percentage and then battle points.
Yeah.
There are, again, there's a lot of discussions here with some people griping about it, some people saying that, this way because it prevents some nonsense. There are valid arguments on both sides. I talked with the judges, I talked with a bunch of players specifically about this thing. There are 100% reasonable arguments on both sides.
Yeah, well, and with battle points, it's like you can have a really competitive close game with a low scoring battle points.
Sure. And the opposite is also true. There's an argument for, but I worked really hard to get my 95 points. And some other guy who won and kind of phoned in the last 2 turns and ended up winning with a 60 point shouldn't, I should be above that guy who phoned it in, that sort of thing.
No, I get
it. But again, there's multiple arguments on both sides here. You can also make the opposite argument of, especially round 1, right? It's random pairings. So now this guy who is poised to be in the top 15 because he's a good player plays against some guy who's never been to a tournament before and he absolutely crushes him. Should he get the benefit of luck in order, he already got the luck of the win, kind of? Should he get the benefit of, but he maxed points and some other guy who had a really close game?
Right. Well, and then didn't they do
both good players.
Random pairings for the first few rounds before you got put into brackets?
Well, no. So it was random pairings for the first round. And then they used this wins and opponent win percentage to pair people up after.
Okay.
Then we went to brackets, which then basically put us in a bunch of mini tournaments. So I was 4-1 starting the brackets. So now I'm in a new mini tournament that is only 4-1. So I'll only ever get paired against people 4-1 at the end of 5 rounds.
Right.
But amongst that bracket, now it goes to wins in bracket and opponent win percentage as the breakdown for who I would face during the bracket.
Gotcha. Okay.
So long story short, there was a lot of talk about this. some people that were upset because, again, they worked really hard for their battle points and they're trying, and they felt like they were getting a lower ranking than they deserved because they tried to get all those points. And then people who were scoring lower.
I like opponent win percentage. However, it gets a little weird because you have this weird relationship with your opponent and their performance, which is not really your performance.
Correct. That's the main argument against it, is that people are saying like, oh, well, the guy who, is competitive in top 10 or whatever, if he plays someone who's terrible or who's never been there, and that's not even his fault, right? It's random pairings. If he plays him early and that guy wins all of his games for the rest of the tournament, he will always be, let's say, at a super major fucking 10, 15 ranks lower because that first guy's like tanking his opponent win percent. So even if he is like, he totally won it last year and he's the best and whatever else, I'm not even saying that's true because, a lot of changes happened, but that guy arguably is penalized for playing a bad opponent.
Yeah.
If you have really tough matchups, which you are not really in control of, especially when there's 400 some people, it's really hard to say, well, but you put me up against easy opponents, and while I appreciate the wins, I could have won against a tougher opponent, and now you're reducing my rank.
Right.
Because that's out of my control. What is in my control is battle point. So now, again, if we're talking about, and the takeaway here from what I kind of gathered is that if you're playing a big event versus playing a smaller event, one argument I think wins over the other. The bigger the event is, me and several other people kind of came to the consensus of battle points over opponent win percentage probably makes a lot of sense because you're less in control of your opponent if they drop out, especially with a 9-round event. If they drop out early, your opponent win percentage gets totally tanked. But if you're playing battle points at a big event, you have to earn those. And there's so many games that the battle points, because, it starts to filter out over the course of so many games, the battle points start to be a lot more accurate.
Right.
Smaller events, the opposite's true, right? At smaller events, you play the one guy who's never been to a tournament before because it's the first time in your shop or whatever. You totally crush him. Well, that's great, but now you have a distinct advantage over other people, and the likelihood in like a normal 3-round event that you play on like a Saturday that someone's going to drop out and tank your opponent win percentage, things like that, that's way less likely to happen. So now,
I see what you're saying.
Percentage makes a lot of sense at smaller events.
Right. Okay, so the rounds were timed, right?
Yes. So rounds were timed 3 hours. I kind of touched on this a little earlier. The timing markers, announced them, were probably the best thing I've seen. Because the short answer here is we had 3 players, and while we were on a team and we practiced to not be slow, we are playing with a bunch of random people, right? Like amongst the team, we have played against people who were there for their first time, been there and been in like the top 10 of last year's Nova. Like, we ran the gambit. And no matter what, every one of us 3 never went to time. We were always done in time, no problem. We played against all kinds of lists, between elitist, between horde, between whatever. Even, Jake was playing Tyranids, and not a small number, but a real amount of Tyranids. He played against an orc player, and he still didn't go to time. Mitchell playing tanks, so he should be faster, right? He's got less models.
Yeah.
He also played against an orc player who's running a horde thing, didn't go to time. Like, and this is all true the opposite as well. I played against a Necron player that was running just a bunch of, tough units, so he didn't have very many. We didn't go to time. Yeah. The announcements helped out so much. It really helped people keep up with time, so they knew when they were behind. But for me specifically, because I'm usually a fast player anyway, it actually helped me the opposite as well. When they say, hey, you should be starting round 3, and we're starting round 4, I know that I have extra time, so I should calm down, make better decisions, stop rushing so much. So it goes both ways, and I think it was huge. Chess clocks obviously have been a solution to try to fix the past, because people complaining about, I couldn't get it done in time, I'm playing too many models, that chess clocks do kind of fix that. But as much as chess clocks could fix that, it's a thing that people aren't used to. So chess clocks tend to get kind of flubbed a lot.
Yeah.
Of course, across like 200 some tables, if everyone was on chess clocks, there's going to be a lot of judge calls for like, no, I wasn't pressing my button, I forgot about it, I'm 2 o'clock, but I totally have used less time than my opponent. Why am I out of time, sort of. And that could be a problem. But it was a really nice balance. But calling these markers out, if you were behind, you call over a judge, you get a chess clock, and then only the people that are running behind get the chess clock. Which those people, because they're feeling the pressure of we're behind, really pay attention to the chess clock and arguably mess it up less often.
Yeah. So end of rounds were strictly enforced. How did that go?
Okay, so this is arguably a gripe, but it's a necessary thing that they did.
Yeah.
So I'm not actually complaining. It just, a lot of the players were complaining about this, so it was fair to bring up. When we were playing, there were times where an issue would happen. People would drop last minute, or, we're waiting on the pairings to go up, that sort of thing. If the round started late, it didn't matter the reason, whether it was the judges were fumbling to fix a thing because the brackets were acting up, or, people dropped last minute. So hey, sorry, we got to read pairings real quick. It didn't matter when it started. There was a scheduled time for the round to start. And even if you started late, totally not your fault, the round still ended at the same time. So the ending was strictly enforced. And there were a couple of rounds, I think there was 2 out of 9, where we got started late because the judges, were having to fix an issue or whatever else late, and we missed out on that time. That being said, when you were talking about running a super major where you've got 3 days of 3-hour, 3-hour games, and people need to get, they need to get out on time so that they can get some food, some rest before they have to come in early the morning. When you're talking Sunday, people have to get out and get home, have planes or trains or whatever else. It's a necessary thing that they had to do. If the thing got started late, that sucks, but also we have to end at the same time because that pushes everything else back, and it's a necessary issue. Yeah. But it was a thing that a lot of people kind of felt upset about, is when in the heat of the moment, it's I'm trying to win my next round, and you just shorted me 15 minutes out of my 3 hours. Right. I might need that.
You said most people finished within time, but when people weren't and they were coming to end a round, did they just tell them put their dice down? We're scoring from wherever it is.
Yes. So for the most part, while I didn't see it, I heard that there was a couple of times where they got very strict about hey, we called dice down. I came over here after it was called, and I see you're still rolling dice. No, stop that. Score right now. You're done. Again, this is, it might sound a little harsh, especially if that happened to be in one of the rounds where they shorted the early time. I'm not saying that's when it happened, but it's right. One of those things that arguably is pretty necessary. If you allow people to, take an extra 5 minutes or an extra 10 minutes, while that is, a lot of us would say reasonable, because it's there's a break in between each round. It's not like I'm hurting anybody. I'm just using up some of my break time. I could use the extra couple of minutes just so that we could make sure that the math is right. Well, it sounds reasonable, but now you are getting an advantage over everyone else who, followed the rules and got done in time. That sort of thing. Especially,
in my opinion, because it's I go, you go, and there's a top and bottom of each battle round. You have to score at the end of a battle round. You can't have one person finish half a turn or whatever.
Yep. And this is where, especially on the team, we talked about this ahead of time several times. And luckily for us, they were calling out time markers. But in addition to that, we kind of, before we even knew they were going to call out time markers, we talked about it and we said, hey, there's a hard 15 minutes at the end. If we are within 15 minutes of the end, we need to stop playing, period. And we need to talk it out. because even when you're talking out, there's still a few things you're going to have to roll, right? Because it's like, oh, I think you're going to kill that unit, I'm going to kill that unit, and then your opponent says like, oh man, but they got a 4 pinball, I don't actually know you kill that. Yeah. So you might need to roll stuff out while you're talking it out. So just saying you're going to talk it out doesn't mean that it's an easy, quick, like 5-minute thing.
No, that's true. No, I get it.
So we talked about like a hard 15 minutes in a 3-hour round. At 15 minutes, we need to talk everything out that makes sense. And if there's something that we're going to argue about, we still have enough time, because we gave ourselves that time, to roll out those like 2 combats or whatever else, so that we get a fair number while talking it out and we don't end up arguing.
Yeah.
Now, I will say, in our games for the team, I think only one time did people really have to talk it out. Yeah. And they were still, they still got done like 10 minutes ahead of time, and they talked out basically round 5. So they were pretty close to being able to do it anyway. But that was like the closest I think we got. At all the other games they had plenty of time. We got done. We still had an extra like 30 minutes till the end of the round to go check on, each other and things like that.
Okay, so how was the state of the meta? You're gonna like this one.
So I'm calling this state of the meta because a lot of things will, kind of like say state of the game, and I almost wrote it up here myself. But I'm going to call this state of the meta because not only is this like a snapshot in time, right? Like Nova is a thing, but how long can you say this is the state of the game when there's points updates or, Blood Angels Codex released and things like that? Because like we saw several Blood Angels players there, but their Codex released like the week after. So can you really even like judge them when their Codex isn't even the same anymore? So state of the meta, this little snapshot in time, I think it does give us some really good information about what's going on in the game, but it's not something I'm going to hard and fast say like this is the new answer. But what things that we noticed is there was an absolute ton of Chaos players, whether it was demons or Thousand Suns or Chaos Space Marines,
World Eaters,
World Eaters.
And also there were some certain things that seemed obligatory, like the Great Unclean One.
Yes. So there was a lot more Chaos than we expected to see. That's not a complaint. I'm actually super happy for it. We went into this saying that at least I was saying personally that I'm like, man, I think Thousand Suns are way better than they're showing up in numbers right now on the tournament list that we're watching, like the Meta Watch and stuff like that. Yeah. I'm like, man, I think Thousand Suns are really good. And then we got there and we were looking around and there were a lot of Thousand Suns players that I saw. And it was like, man, I knew it, right? And I feel good about that because I feel like the thing. But even after all the games and the shakeout, there was still a lot more Chaos that was doing well than I think we've seen in the past. That's not to say that they weren't good before and they are good now or anything like that. I'm just saying there's definitely a better showing of Chaos than I've seen at some of the other GTs that we've gone to. In addition to that, there was a lot of people talking about how things are becoming very elitist. Whether it's running the all tank list like Mitchell was doing, or whether it's a bunch of monsters like in Tyranids and stuff like that. I think we actually saw a pretty good diversity. It clearly leans more elite by a little bit, but there was orc players that basically didn't have a single vehicle. There was Tyranid players that were running. I played a Tyranid player that I think had a single monster in the list, and they were doing good. So because the Tyranid player that that didn't have but one monster, he was actually I played him in the brackets when I was 4-1, so he was doing pretty solid.
Was he doing the horde thing?
Sort of, yeah. He was running a ton of Gene Stealers and a ton of Raveners. So he was playing some of the weird things that we don't see a ton of. But he was doing really well with it. He was also running the advance and charge detachment like I was, which made it a crazy slog in the middle. But
yeah. So what were the problem units?
Okay, so there's a. This is hard to say because obviously there's three of us, and the three of us played a bunch of different lists. That being said, even the three of us couldn't get like a good grasp of the whole event, right? As far as like, it turns out Nurglings are the problem. I'm not saying they are, but like there are definitely things that we found that we kind of saw as problems. That being said, I'm not saying that they are like meta breaking. I'm just saying that they were like, man, okay, maybe I see people's points. That's a little more, a little too expensive or a little too cheap for what it's doing.
Yeah.
But there's a couple of things. I think the Transcendent C'tan is probably a little undercost. I say that because I played against a list that was 6 C'tan. That is the max number you could take. 3 named characters plus the 3 of the non-named character. And the non-named character, I think, is probably a little too cheap. I'm not mad at it. I don't think it was like game winning because I had a really good match. It was really close. He had 6 C'tan by the end of the game. I was able to kill 5 of the 6. Like, they're not unkillable. But I do think they were definitely outvaluing me by a real margin. So they should probably go up in points a little bit. Nurglings are still crazy. Even after they got their actions taken away from them. And I think most people agree that Nurglings were one of the units that were targeted by that rule change. Nurglings still happen to be crazy. They're an extremely good unit that if you don't have infiltrators yourself, then as an assault army, they become crippling. Because they either infiltrate and block you in on turn 1, or they go first and they walk forward and block you in even harder. So it's one of those things that if you're playing especially assault units, it becomes very difficult. If you're playing only vehicle-based stuff like Mitchell was, it becomes extremely efficient. And when they took actions away from them, they made some of the bigger sized units a little cheaper, which at the time we all said, it's reasonable. They the thing, but as much as it was reasonable then, I think it probably shouldn't have been reduced in points, only because while it seemed reasonable, the reason they were getting that taken away from them was because they were so good. That's why they were being targeted in the first place. So they probably deserved the nerf, a trade-off, which is kind of what they got. As far as screening is concerned, obviously this is a thing that I harp on my team all the time, but the better players, you can almost pick them out right away because they can screen better, whether it's screening for like turn 1 charges or whether it's screening for preventing deep strike, things like that. At Nova, where you see a lot of really good players, you got 400 some players, there's going to be a good concentration of them. Screening is a giant thing that really turns the game pretty fast.
Yeah. Okay.
Unit spamming is a thing that some people talked about, like the 3 C'tan shards, like I talked about, that's spamming the unit after you've already taken the 3 named character versions. As much as I want to say that, like, if you're running 3 of a thing and every named character version, that's probably too much. And that's part of why I think it's fair to adjust their points. I'm going to take a step back from that and say that's not really really a thing that we saw much of. There were units that were being spammed, and I think, for example, every Thousand Suns player I saw there was running 3 Vortex Beasts. I'm not saying they all were, but everyone I saw was for sure running 3 Vortex Beasts. Is it reasonable that the unit is so good that every player, no matter whether they're running Magnus or not running Magnus, or they're running Scarab Terminators, or they're running Rubik Marine Spam.
I mean,
it doesn't matter what their list is. If they're all playing 3 of this unit because it's that good, maybe it's a little too cheap.
I would say there's a counter argument that when you only have like 5 data sheets, I mean, what are you going to do?
Yep.
So, I mean, it's like Grey Knights running Dread Knights. They're not necessarily...
I totally hear you, right? The same thing becomes with... Yeah, absolutely. And there's a fair argument to that, right? Like, no, this is one of the best units in my codex. Of course I would. It's so good. I certainly play 2 of it. Maybe I play. That's fair. Where I think it kind of goes the other way is if another good example is demon players, right? It turns out I played against a demon player that was running and a great unclean one with one hand. And then I played against a guy that was running all Nurgle.
You're kind of breaking up.
And then I played against... Okay, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. You played against something in a great unclean one? What, Nurglings, I assume?
Yeah, so when playing against the demon players, because I played against 2 different ones, and then there was another player of ours that went against demons, it turns out they were playing all Khorne for one list. There was another one that was playing heavy Slaanesh. There was another one that was playing heavy Nurgle. And it turns out every demon player, it doesn't matter whether or not they say they're... Every single one of them was taking the Great Unclean one with the Nurgle enhancement to give it 4 Feel No Pain. Like...
Yeah.
Again, he's really good, but also is that unit too undercosted where it doesn't... I only play... Feels so obligated to play this unit because it's so much better than everything else he has access to.
No,
maybe we should look at some points adjustments for that sort of thing. Obviously, we want almost every unit in the game to be playable in some form, right? That's the idea of balance. I'm not saying we'll ever get there, but that's the goal.
Right. Okay, so...
However, you don't want the one thing to be so much better than everything else that it feels obligatory to play and not an option that you're choosing.
So what did we learn? Odd? What did we learn? Oh, the engagement range thing.
Yeah, so it's
so funny.
I will go into the engagement range thing later in another video, but the short answer here that I ran down a giant rabbit hole for was it was pointed out to me that engagement range is a model being...
Nope, we lost you
most
again.
of the time. Okay, you got me back.
Engagement range is blank. Something.
So engagement range is being within an inch of the enemy. That's it. That is not what we usually say, but that is the actual ruling. The difference here is when it comes to what models are fight, that's where we introduce a model within base contact of a model within base contact. That little chaining effect.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of times where this really matters. But again, I'll go deeper into this into another video. But the short answer here is if something says while this model's within, like let's say a jump chaplain, because that's what a lot of Space Marine players are using. If the jump chaplain needs to be within engagement range of the enemy, well, he could be base to base with a model in base to base and get to swing. But he's not actually within engagement range, which means he doesn't get to do his mortal wound roll.
Oh, I see.
It goes way deeper than this. Again, I ran down a whole rabbit. It's little things like this to a tournament, and because all of our different play groups have kind of found these weird rules in as, they've played different lists and played with different things, just reread different parts of the book multiple times. Going to these tournaments helps teach you a lot. Is the difference between engagement range versus fighting that big of a deal? No. There's a couple instances where it matters. If you're not playing those, is it that big of a deal? Maybe not so much. Knowing that, though, going to this tournament and learning that, because even I learned pointed out to me specifically. Now I can take that back to my play group and not only, but now I get to go down the rabbit hole. All these didn't realize to, not just the one that was pointed out to me in my list, that really makes a big impact on the game.
Yeah.
Moving on, there was a hobby section. So obviously everyone there got their 10 points for painting, their army just for having it painted, because that was a requirement to be there. It's a super major, totally fair. That being said, they had a effectively separate hobby competition where every army, a judge went around and, took a generic score, made some notes for those who were like, this seems like they went above and beyond. And then they invited the people who went on to do like the main hobby competition of this like side event, as it were. Well, one of the things we noted, being me talking with other players, not just our team, is that people with display boards got way higher points, even if their army was arguably not painted as well as some others. So the display boards were heavily pointed, and we've kind of seen the same thing at other GTs as well, like Adepticon, where they really encourage the kind of nice display boards, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. What about conceding?
So
how does that work actually?
That's a great question, and the answer is talk with your opponent. Which,
okay, that's simple enough.
Yeah, you're right. It sounds simple, and it should be simple. But when you're talking about a big event where people are trying to win, it becomes unclear. Right. Because if you're playing with your, at like a small RTT, right? Basically, whoever goes undefeated wins, and that's the answer, because it's a couple of rounds. It's not that big a deal. Conceding actually doesn't really change all that much. So it's not that big a deal, which is why the rule talk with you. When you are at a super major where tiebreakers amongst all the people who only lost one game, well, it turns out the tiebreakers could take you from, let's say, 10th rank all the way down to like 100th rank. Not actually that far, but like it could drop you a lot. Now, your battle points or your opponent win percentage could mean a lot. So how do you score conceding? And the issue with this isn't that conceding happens. It's totally okay to concede, especially over 9 games. If you're not having fun and you've clearly lost, everybody, including you and me, is going to be happier with, let's take an extra 30 minutes of break and just call the game here. Let's go, get a drink and hang out and be happy and play the next game and continue to enjoy our week. Yeah. The downside with conceding, though, is that some tables were saying, if you concede, I get max 100. And other tables were saying, if you concede, I'm going to flip cards and determine how many points I could have gotten. And then, even though you're conceding to me and I win, I'm only going to score the points that I could have actually scored.
Right.
It's like if I've already missed out on too many primary, there is you conceding does not magically allow me to earn primary that I've already.
Well, and then it kind of messes up the battle points versus win percentage thing.
Correct. And this is where, there's another argument for a big event should be using battle points. But as much as we feel that way, not the organizers, but as much as we feel that way, that is only true when you take it a step further and like, okay, eating, so that if you concede, this is how it's scored, so that the battle points are more fair.
Yeah.
Saying that we're going to go by opponent win percentage allows you to not necessarily ignore this problem, but it allows this problem to be.
Yeah, I just think an auto 100 is too powerful if we're going to lean on battle points for the scoring tiebreakers.
I agree. Because, again, if I put up a hard fight and, I prevent you from scoring some points, but you are clearly, like, going to table me, end up scoring more than me, if the game would end at like a 60 to 70 or something, and I say we don't need to play the last round out, should you just earn an extra 30 points that you didn't?
Yeah, that is like
I kind of think no.
It's kind of functionally not possible. Like, you know what I mean?
Correct.
Because someone can get 100 legit playing through the whole game, and that's why I think it's kind of screwed up.
Right, and that was a concern. It wasn't a thing that I think actually people were too upset about, but it was a thing that people like started to get a little upset about when it came up.
Yeah,
because they were like, but why are you getting 100?
Yes.
Like, I don't actually know. I don't know. It's a thing that I don't mind it going either way. I don't think it should go to an easy 100, but at least if they, said this is how conceding works, you get an even 100, period. At least every concede would be on equal footing, which I think would make it feel a little better. But again, I hope it doesn't go that way. And I don't plan on running my events, but at least it's a thing that makes.
Yeah. Okay. We should probably wrap it up.
Yep.
Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll catch you later. Don't forget to wear shoes.
Yeah.